Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to express sincere thanks as ever to all of our wonderful guests who shared their time with me, their energy and incredible wisdom through season 8. I'd also like to thank, more importantly, all of our listeners now spanning more than 85 countries right across the globe. So thank you. And as ever, thanks again for the really positive feedback. This really helps the show whenever you go on to iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts on YouTube, just to give that feedback in relation to the show. I want to share some of that with you. So one listener said, great content and perspective. I have only found a few great business and ops related podcasts, and this is one of them. Really impressed with their guests and Brendan's knowledge. Excellent topics and discussion. Another guest said, fantastic guests and insights. As a business owner, this podcast is gold. Fantastic guests, and Brendan really digs deep in his questions. Highly recommend to anyone who wants to learn and improve their business. And what I would also ask you to do, if you're enjoying the podcast, why not subscribe to our ScaleX Insider 321 newsletter, where each week we provide you with 3 timeless takeaways, 2 inspirational quotes, and 1 reflection question to support your scaling psyche. Now, without further ado, drum roll, please. Claire, you're very welcome to the ScaleX Insider podcast. Great to see you again.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back. Whereas the first quarter of the year.
I know we always say this, but it's just incredible. 3 months. It was back in January when we recorded the wrap up for season 7, and we're now into approaching the start of May, which just is incredible. So how's the first quarter been for you?
I was thinking about the first quarter earlier this year. We have had a couple of trips this year. We had a wonderful visit to Japan in February with 17 wonderful business leaders, all of whom are scaling up their business. So that was terrific. And the first quarter, other than flying by, it's been great, really great. I can't believe we've actually now landed in the middle of April. So
yes,
yeah, great to be back.
A memorable trip to Japan where we visited Toyota to see firsthand the Toyota production system, the origins of lean, Kaizen, and all things continuous improvement. Such a wonderful trip, and great insight into our 5th principle, which is process. So we really immersed ourselves in all things process. What an incredible trip. And yes, an experience of a lifetime, I have to say. So definitely worth calling that out.
Absolutely.
So you've been indulging in all of the episodes in relation to the previous season. What were your reflections from season 8?
Well, another brilliant season. I completely agree with all the feedback that you've just shared from your other listeners in terms of all of the great tools and techniques that we can take away from these brilliant high quality conversations. But I think I did mention to you Alan Dibb, and he talks about opening up an inch and going down a mile deep. And I felt that all of the conversations you were having with people, you got the opportunity to go really deep. And what we found down there was a great set of frameworks. From Whitney Johnson with the S-curve to Kim Scott with the radical candor quadrant, Alan Dibb with the 7-page stepped marketing plan. You and I share the love of a great framework, and most of your guests, I felt this season, offered a framework which act as a really good guide to help to develop our understanding and help to put it in context in terms of where we may be on that particular journey. So loved the frameworks that we were offering, that your guests were offering, and loved the depth of the conversations. And I think as well, in reflection, it's just really good to develop a little bit more language around experiences that certainly I would have and never had the language around them before. So I learned an awful lot. Fantastic guests this season. Well done.
Yeah, I would add to that. And I love the way you tie the season together. I hadn't picked that up. But you're absolutely right, and I would add to the the frameworks that you've already called out. We had the framework for capacity building, Bob Glazer, a wonderful framework where we looked at 4 different components to build the capacity of your team, which speaks loudly to our third principle of scaling, which is people, of course. And then John Gomes with a
Yeah.
wonderful framework, which is just one framework he has outlined in his book, which is Leading in a Nonlinear World. And that's the framework for building a mindset for scaling, which again was very instructive, very practical, and really spoke loudly to the very first principle of our scaling
Yeah.
framework, psyche. So brilliant. I love
There's
that.
one more point, sorry, I'd love to add is that whenever you're hearing the accents of your guests, obviously coming from all different parts of the world, it makes the world feel much smaller and much more connected. And it's lovely to hear different thought leaders from the US, from Australia, from in previous episodes, you would have multiple guests from all around Europe, from England. And it's great to hear what other people's views from different parts, different pockets of the world are. And I know you also do your bit to get the good old Northern Irish accent out to the world as well. So I just, it was a reflection that I had with all the various different locations, obviously, that the guests come from, and to get those, I guess, different perspectives on things. So love that as well.
Yeah, and that's a nice little nod to a characteristic of a scaling mindset. You think beyond your existing borders, you think
Yeah.
in a divergent way, and you're embracing lots of different opinions and attitudes and understanding and insight. So I really like that. For you, what were some of the emerging themes throughout the season?
Well, there was a couple of new themes that came through, I felt, over the whole series of episodes, and a couple of recurring themes that I picked up on as well, and maybe started to think a little bit deeper on those because the conversations allowed me to go there. But the first theme, there'll be a lot of conversations that you're having around the concept of purpose. And I felt over these 10 episodes, multiple people actually started to talk a little bit more about how organizations, or sorry, how people can align their personal purpose with their organizational purpose. And certainly, Mark Devine talked about whenever your personal purpose intersects with your organizational purpose, that's when you get real flow. So I really enjoyed that. Obviously, Kevin McCarthy talked a lot about purpose as well, and he made a really good point. I felt that as a business leader, whenever you don't have your purpose fully understood and defined, your vision, your mission, and your values, essentially you will be the go-to person for all of the rest of your team. You're the one, and likely to be a bottleneck, because your purpose and your vision and your values contain so many messages that the team need to be aware of, and they're working so hard on your behalf if you take the time to define them. So I think that was brilliant. You know, Kevin really extracted that well. I love the term he used. He talked about, instead of talking about the greater purpose, seek the common purpose. So it's one that everybody can align to. And it took me to a conversation you and I had had very recently. And some people find it quite challenging to get their head around this. In terms of the people that we work with, some people would be fairly new to the concept of purpose, and some people are very well, it's really well understood. But for those who are really new to purpose, we had a great conversation with a group of leaders where we used the sporting analogy of football pitch, for example, when the purpose of the football team potentially would be to score goals or maybe maintain their position in the league. Whereas an individual player has a very specific role to play as part of that team, and therefore contributing to that common purpose of the full team. So you may be in defense, you may be a striker, you may be somebody within a sports team who's constantly trying to get the ball out wide, but you have a very specific role. So I think that's a really good way to help people to understand the concepts behind personal purpose and organizational purpose, and how whenever those are both aligned, you have that flow And sometimes whenever they're not aligned, you can really start to question why you're on that pitch, or is it the right pitch for you to be on? So
Yeah.
that came through multiple times.
Yeah, I really like this, and I've been reflecting on this a lot. I read Kevin McCarthy's book, The On Purpose Person, one of his books, actually, which is a wonderful book. And he has articulated in a really simple, clear way the difference between purpose, vision, mission, and values. And I know we don't reference mission in our work because it's often confused and gets mixed between vision and purpose or something in between. And for us, vision is where do you want to go, and purpose is why you want to go there. What do you give meaning to? Kevin adds mission in there to express how you're going to do that, which speaks to our fourth principle, which is planning. And of course the values piece, which is what you're feeling in your gut, what ultimately drives the decisions that you make. Now, I've been reflecting on purpose. I've been reading the Yvonne Chouinard's wonderful book, Let My People Go Surfing. And where leaders are getting caught up in purpose or feeling compelled, if they don't already have that, as Kevin McCarthy said, it's not a case of, you're going to walk across the beach one day and kind of discover this shell amongst all of the other shells, and you go, da-da, this is the shell I've been looking for, aka your purpose. It's ultimately what you give meaning to. And the Patagonia story, they're an exemplar now. People will associate Patagonia with a significant cause-based purpose, but it didn't start out as a cause-based purpose. It started out as a competency-based purpose. Yvonne Chouinard wanted to create the greatest piton, climbing piton, that he could, because he found the quality in the pitons that he was using were inferior. And he went back after using those to a local blacksmith shop and started to fabricate a higher quality piton. He wanted to increase the competency, wanted to increase his competency in relation to the product which he was beginning to bring to initially use for himself, and then bring that to a wider customer base. That competency-based purpose evolved into a culture-based purpose as more and more people started to use his product and fell in love with his product and wanted to join his purpose of bringing this to a wider customer audience. And Patagonia's culture is quite famous, hence the name of the book, Let My People Go Surfing. They don't have regular hours, as it's certainly in the early days that wasn't the case. And if the surf was breaking, people went and enjoyed that. And it evolved then from competency to culture to a cause-based purpose, where he has now gifted the company to the environment, for the benefit of the environment, and put it into a trust. So for leaders really challenged with this, ultimately ask the question, what do you give meaning to? And if that's about creating the best product in your industry, well, you're well on the way to actually unearthing your purpose there. If it's about creating a wonderful culture, then again, you are ultimately on the road to developing your purpose, and then these evolve into cause-based purposes. We can't all create companies which are going to save the world, certainly initially, but Patagonia's story lays out, it creates the stepping stones for us to see how we could potentially get there. So,
no, great, really great. And you can imagine then, whenever you take the time, as you say, this is not something you create. You have to peel the layers back to understand it. Whenever you understand your own personal purpose and it's aligned with your organization,
absolutely,
that's whenever you start to operate on a whole different level.
Absolutely. And what we say is, your vision then for your business is the ultimate expression of your purpose. Yeah. Now, purpose without vision is huge potential unrealized. And as Kevin McCarthy says in his book, vision without purpose becomes a very distracting illusion,
Yeah,
which is very
absolutely.
powerful. So we could talk about purpose, devote this podcast to purpose, but any other strong themes for you throughout the season?
Yeah, another great theme coming through fairly regularly was all around feedback, which I loved listening to. Kim Scott was absolutely incredible. Loved that radical candor quadrant. I find it really fascinating. And that was a great example of how she was providing language around things that certainly would be going through my head before. She describes obnoxious aggression. I would have described that as brute force and ignorance. I've never really understood the concept really of ruinous empathy. I think I've heard terminal niceness before, which again could be ruinous empathy. But the one real thing that sparked thoughts with me was whenever she actually described the sand pile. And we both have worked with people within organizations. In fact, most of your listeners have as well, who would approach things with obnoxious aggression. And it tends to be respected because people like that get stuff done, and that's always a real tick in the box. That's people kind of moving forward, making progress. And she talked about the analogy with the sand pile, but the wet sand pile. So whenever you put a grain of obnoxious aggression on top of that sand pile, it will hold steady for long. Well, sorry, maybe not for that long, but it'll hold steady for a while. But then eventually it won't make it to the long term and it will all come crashing down. And I thought that was just a brilliant, brilliant way to describe how obnoxious aggression will may get you results in the short term, but it won't help you to scale your business in the long term. So whenever people go quiet in meetings, for example, those are the signals that you need to pay attention to, and you need to start asking questions. Are there people who maybe fall into that category? Are they silencing the people that you really need to be hearing from? And are people communicating? Are they connecting with one another? Or but equally so on the flip side, are people being given clear feedback? Do people have clear expectations of where they are and how they're performing all the time? And the other extreme with ruinous empathy is that we don't share that with people, and people are kind of just a little bit aimless and lost. So loved her analogy. Robert Glazer also talked about feedback, and I really liked what he said. He talked about feedback should be delivered within 72 hours because a difficult conversation will never get any easier. And in fact, quite the opposite. It just consumes an enormous amount of energy and distraction the longer we put it off because we don't stop thinking about it. So yeah, the theme of feedback came up with multiple guests. I really love. So again, the concept of sorry, I'm going to refer to my notes here because she said something very specific. She said radical candor is measured not at the speaker's mouth but the listener's ear.
Yeah, so profound.
Isn't it? And I think, whenever we, all of a sudden, whenever we feel that we're really good at giving feedback, that we've mastered it, and, certainly a lovely little tool. She talked about CORN, which was context, observation, result, and next step. I would always share a very simple model, very similar to that, called AID. So it's, what is the action that I observed? What is the impact that it has just had? And what is the desired change that I'd like to see? So whenever we feel that we've mastered that bit really well, I think we've also got to think beyond that, and we've got to think, well, are we good at receiving it? Because whenever we get really good at receiving it and giving it, then we've mastered it. So really, that whole theme of feedback is fantastic, and having that regular feedback. And certainly, we always use the analogy again of the sports pitch, where the coach is standing on the sidelines. They're giving you feedback on your tactics. They're helping you to figure out how to navigate a tricky opponent, or all on tactics. And they certainly don't wait even to the end of the game, never mind the end of the season or the end of the year, to give you feedback on your performance. So
It's
getting really good in that, and embedding that within your business is a brilliant place to be.
that's brilliant, Claire. I love your AID acronym as well, and I know you reference the coaching analogy in our book, which again, people will really understand that. And the big takeaway for me from Kim's interview, very simply, care personally, but challenge directly.
Yeah.
And when you really understand that, when you go in to a conversation with a mindset that there's a person at the other end of this, a person who is going to feel the impact of what you're delivering, it's a great place to start. But ultimately, creating the culture, and there's a lot of talk, over the last number of years about creating psychological safety, creating an environment where people are inviting that feedback for the betterment of themselves, for the betterment of their teams, and ultimately the betterment of their organization and the customers that they serve. So, when it's received in that way, then everyone benefits. But you've got to create the culture which supports it in the first instance.
Totally agree. And Rob Glazer, again, going back to what he said, he talked about psychological safety, and he says having a high level of psychological safety in your business is like trust on steroids.
Yeah.
You know,
And Claire, in your experience, how can leaders listening really create that psychological safety? Practically, what can they take away for the moment they stop listening to this? What would you invite them to become very aware of? Because this seems like a nice strap line, but what does it mean in practice?
well, I would probably go straight to creating that really good basis of trust. That's where I would go first. And trust stems from spending time with people and being transparent with people. And the time with people is, spending time with people requires you to kind of get to know them on a personal level as well. And again, it kind of feeds into what you were talking about, caring personally, but challenging directly. If people believe that you care personally about them and their well-being and their goals and everything for them, both inside and outside work, they'll move mountains for you. But it's doing it in a very authentic way, not just because you think that you have to. Taking time with people, because time is one of our the greatest resources that we've got. So investing our time in people is one thing, but again, being transparent with your information, again, and not hiding things or doing things or giving people surprises. Nobody really likes surprises. So time and transparency, I think, is two things that is a great place to start to build the level of trust. And then your levels of psychological safety will simply grow from that.
Yeah, great. And of course, we want to be building trust with those people who are elf and not half, as Joe Polish referred to.
That's brilliant. Absolutely.
So,
Woo, we
any
need more of those woo moments.
yeah, we need to avoid the people and bring more woo people into our organizations. Claire, purpose and feedback, two great themes. Anything else?
There was, and I don't want to cover old ground from previous wrap-ups, but vulnerability was coming through again, and great respect for. It started with Mark Devine talked about how he felt he was going down this path at like a high-speed train, but he actually found he was going down the wrong path, and eventually he derailed and broke down. And I hugely respect people who have got the confidence and the courage to express that level of vulnerability. And of course, Joe Polish speaks very openly about his history with addiction and debt and so on. And it kind of got me thinking a little bit that what I notice is people becoming people becoming more comfortable with expressing a level of vulnerability after the event. But where we need to get really good at is expressing a level of vulnerability before the event happens. And that boils down to our ability to surrender that level of control and ask for help. I believe, and actually, whenever we're really clear on ourselves, and it evolves back around to that whole piece about self-reflection. Whenever we're really sure of ourselves, not that we ever get really sure of ourselves, but whenever we become more sure of our strengths, we understand what we're good at, and then we're a little bit more forgiving. to ourselves whenever we can hand over the things that we're actually not that strong on and give it to other people around us. So it just took me down a real rabbit hole to say, I love to hear this. I love to hear people sharing their stories. And more and more I'm hearing it, but they're telling the story that they've overcome. We still have an issue with helping people to be more vulnerable whenever they're in the situation or before the situation even happens.
Yeah, you're so true. And as you speak, what's your thoughts on whether is this something we become more comfortable with as we grow older, as we get into our 40s and 50s? And, what would you say to those younger leaders who are really trying to improve themselves, the type A, type high achievers that want to be seen to be able to do everything that they're asked and demonstrate this impenetrable nature? And is it an age thing? And what would you say to younger leaders?
Yeah, I can only lean in my own experience, to be honest. And certainly, I don't think that I would have been that confident sharing my vulnerability in my 20s and 30s, certainly more so late 30s, kind of 40s.
Mm.
I would be, I guess I go instantly to Rand Gottfridson's work, where our ability to develop ourselves vertically as opposed to horizontally and really have that in-depth understanding of ourselves, why we're doing what we're doing, what we want to achieve. And whenever we've got a good understanding of that, I think that then gives us confidence. Um, but equally, what I would what I would suggest to anybody, regardless of age, I think it probably does become easier with age, but regardless of age, I would encourage people to speak about it, to even talk through the process, because whenever you speak very clearly and very honestly, and it always takes me to a fantastic HR director I worked with once, and she used to say, okay, excuse me, okay, Claire, let's sit down and talk through this together. She never pretended to have the answers, or she never jumped to the conclusion. Let's sit down and talk through this together, which we did. And I got so much learning and insight by simply talking through the process. And if people can do that, even in terms of their experiences, that eventually will become somebody else's, probably their survival guide of how to get through these things. So
Great
I think it's a
advice.
really good point you raised there. Yes, you become more confident, I think, really in your own skin the older you become. But we've all got experiences, whether we really understand them early on in our lives is probably less likely.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And again, something Mark LaRousse teased out in the conversation this season, and it's come through as a theme in previous seasons as well: the importance of storytelling, the importance of understanding your own story and those experiences which make you you, and which actually undergird your leadership style, and for you to be forensic in actually truly understanding your own story. Any other themes? Anything else you want to add before we move on?
yeah, I can't. It would be remiss of me not to mention the conversations that came up around emotions. Emotional control, and it probably happened at a time I had a pretty interesting experience myself last week. But it came up from Kevin McCarthy. He talked about doing the heart work, not the hard work. He also talked about, in fact, a number of guests talked about how we can shift that negative energy into positive energy. Absolutely love the work of Jean Gaume. And he talked again about tuning into our negative emotions. Like it or not, we all have negative emotions, but if we just throw them out as negative emotions, we'll never learn from them. And I loved he encouraged us to really understand what those negative emotions were telling us,
Yeah.
and why they were showing up. And last week, on a very personal level, I just returned from a break on holiday. My husband always tells me that, he said it's quite obvious that I have to make a shift whenever I come back into the family environment. I was away with a group of friends, and I found myself last Thursday seeing my glass half full. and that's probably, it's not a place that I'm overly familiar with. Um, but I found as the day went on, I actually took the advice and I shifted my negative emotions and shifted them into a positive place. And it was like I was 30,000 feet above myself. And I was just watching myself pull myself out of this negative state of mind into a positive state of mind, and actually ended the day in great form.
Yeah.
But whenever you're
Yeah.
aware of it, you tune into it a little bit more.
Yeah. Back to that word feedback again, what John said, emotions are feedback, they're not fact.
Yeah,
And it's
great.
just tuning in, and again, a previous guest referred to emotion as energy in motion. It's you becoming aware that there's a there's energy happening there. What's it telling you? And how can you shift that? And
One thing I thought, if Jean Gaume is listening to this, one of the things I thought was really interesting. He says your body typically knows whenever you're making a bad decision before your mind does, and he talked about the benefits of giving a body scan. And I thought, what would he make of potentially premenopausal women who've got kind of raging hormones going through their body? I was like, something like that. You probably need to exercise a little bit of caution with those body scans, because I'm not sure anybody could interpret them.
that's a whole different podcast, Claire. It is very relevant at the moment, I have to say, in our
Yeah,
house. And
there you
yes,
go.
so I
Shouldn't be
can
ignored
absolutely. There's lots
at your
of
peril.
there's lots of feedback going on at the moment. Anyway, anything that really captured your curiosity throughout the season?
Loads, Brendan, but I would say one of the key things that really stood out for me was the S curve, Whitney Johnson's work.
Yeah.
And she put it really nicely. She said peak performance is actually our ability to navigate our own S curve. And again, back to providing us with the language around what we sense and what we go through whenever we experience a change. And I actually related it to my own change, having being in the role of a talent director for 25 years, and really stepping into the world of Simple Scaling as a co-founder. I could intimately relate to every single stage of that S curve. At the beginning, she talked about the excitement and the overwhelm, and the self-doubt, but the impatience at the same time. And then all of a sudden you move quite quickly. And I remember at the time describing that to you like I was going down an icy road at speed, which is incredibly nerve-wracking. But eventually you get to the point, and I'm actually thinking about a specific piece of work in particular. You get to a point where you're doing it, you really enjoy it, and you are likely becoming good at it. But that is you reaching the top of your S curve. And unless you find somebody in your organization to teach everything you know about that and jump onto a new one, that's whenever you potentially can become stagnant. So great messages in there. Love the language around the S curve and everything we go through when we're changing and learning and growing.
Yeah, brilliant. What are you going to do differently as a result of immersing yourself in this season's podcasts?
The $1,000,000 question. I love doing a little bit of a recap. I always say this podcast wrap up holds me to account. And was it the last one? Maybe no, it was a couple ago. I committed to journaling, still really enjoying the process. Took me a
Yes.
little bit of time to get used to, and that was
Yes.
inspired by Jim Lear. And then the last podcast, I committed to doing an exercise suggested by Cameron Herald in a way to help us maintain that high level view of our organizations, that 30,000-foot view, and helping us become less busy. So I created the spreadsheet that Cameron suggested. I started to list down my tasks, started to evaluate my competence against each one of those tasks. And I actually did something in addition to that. I created another column, which I think he suggested working out your hourly rate or something, but I did something slightly different. I looked specifically whether the activities and the tasks were helping to grow the business. And actually, it led me to the same conclusion I've actually just talked about with the S curve, that there are things that I'm spending time on, which I love to do, but is it really having a great impact, and is it really adding value to simple scaling as our business? No. So I probably need, I know I need to hand those over. I need to teach somebody else to do those so that I can actually really then focus on the right things. So that was a really worthwhile exercise. And thanks to Cameron Herald for suggesting that. This time, I'm going to make 2 commitments. And Mark Devine inspired one of them, and I'm reading this here. He says everything we are searching for in life is already within us, and he talked a lot about creating that silent time and meditating. And meditation is something I've never explored with ever in the past. So I'm going to make a commitment to simply explore meditation, see where that goes, see what I learn from it. I'm willing to try anything. And my second commitment then is thanks to Kim Scott and the work on radical candor. And I'm going to make an effort to solicit feedback. And I'm going to really kind of, I guess, watch carefully how I receive the feedback from others. So getting good at giving and getting good at taking is really important. So I'm going to work on those.
Those are brilliant. And again, in our own book, I'm a huge fan of meditation, and funny, I've been listening to some of Ray Dalio's podcast interviews and some of the work that he has put onto YouTube recently. One of the most successful hedge fund managers ever, the founder of Bridgewater, and a huge proponent of meditation. But ultimately, and this goes back to a theme that runs strongly in all of the seasons in terms of doing the mental fitness work. We all can relate to physical fitness, where we go into a gym, we lift weights, we go onto a treadmill, we go onto we'll get onto a bike, and we understand innately what physical fitness looks like. But I think a lot of people struggle with the concept of improving their mental fitness and taking that time out to meditate. And again, people get caught up in well, I'm no good at meditating. It's simply about carving out time, and start with 2 minutes. What's the minimum viable dose? Everyone has 60 seconds, even after listening to this podcast. If you're in the car, before you get out of the car, just set your timer for 60 seconds and just tune into your breath.
Would you meditate on a particular topic?
You can absolutely ask yourself a question before you meditate, and it's a case of really not getting snagged on the thoughts that come into your head. So just letting those thoughts come and go, tuning back into the breath, and training your body with your mind just to sit there, because we are habitually conditioned in a restless way to do stuff. And if actually you can just train your body to sit, stay, and start off with 2 minutes, increase that to 5 minutes, 10 minutes, just using your breath as your point of focus. Ultimately, it's time in the mental gym.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's the most important, because that will enable us to take the action to become physically fit. And it enables everything else. We've had guests on who've spoken to the importance of, mental fitness, physical fitness, your emotional fitness, spiritual fitness, again, aligned to what Bob Glazer was saying in this season, the 4 themes of building your own capacity and ultimately building the capacity of your team. So yeah, look, I wish you all the very best with that, Claire. And
I'll come back to you for tips.
Well, you're very tuned into the breath work which we do throughout our program, and really, this is just this. You know, call it breath work, call it just taking 2 minutes to sit in silence, call it
Yeah.
whatever. I think people get meditation can have connotations of kind of sitting in a yogic pose and lighting a candle and having to clear your mind, and that already gets people feeling very anxious, where it's just literally taking time to sit and teaching your body to sit.
Well, there you go. I will be exploring and practicing that between now and the next wrap up.
Let me know how you get on. And
I
I'm
will.
saying you can teach your mind to sit. You can meditate when you're on your walks. I know you enjoy walking your dog, you go out in nature. It's literally, rather than getting caught up in and snagged on thoughts during that walk, it's again focusing back on the breath. And one tip that I practice is zooming in and out of the background noise when you're on your walk, trying to hear the noise closest to you and then moving that to the noise furthest away, and just
Good
shifting
tip.
your focus. So
Yeah, love that.
brilliant. Well, I'm really looking forward to hearing how you get on with that. As ever, in terms of our wrap up, I always invite you to share your 3 favorite takeaways from this season. So
This
I'm
is a toughie,
interested.
as ever. Um, the first one is going to Joe Polish. I loved his woos and ahs. So that was my favorite takeaway. What are we doing to create more of those woo moments as opposed to the moments that we sometimes get? And we all know what those are. I just love the way that Joe Polish provided that simple language around that. It was funny. So he also said a great thing about be the person that you'd want to answer the phone to.
Yeah.
So both the woos and ahs are great, and it really does give you things to reflect upon. So thanks to Joe Polish for that one. The second one then would be from Jean Gaume. I absolutely fully buy into this. He says, search for brilliant questions. And I think sometimes a really good question can provide you the opportunity to dive deep into something and get a lot more insights in the process as opposed to just being given the answer. So love the power of a really good question. So that's one of my favorite takeaways is search for brilliant questions. So thanks to Jean Gaume for that. And last but not least, this is a recurring theme, and a lot of your guests, again, I totally buy into this, but stop taking ourselves so seriously. Mark Devine said it, he let go of the grip, he talked about. Robert Glazer said it, Joe Polish said it, Alan Dibb, Cameron Herald talks about it, Lee Benson talks about enjoying the journey. And there's a lovely little quote. I've shared this with you already. There's a lovely little quote from the book Big Panda and Tiny Dragon by James Norbury. And it says, which is more important, asked Big Panda, the journey or the destination? And Tiny Dragon says, the company. So I will leave you with that. One of my favorite takeaways: enjoy the journey. We'll all reach the destination. But most importantly, enjoy the company.
Brilliant. And just to let you know, I always answer the phone to you. Claire, have a wonderful Q2, and I look forward to our wrap up again in season 9.
Me too.
In the
It'll fly.
meantime, take care.
Thanks, Brendan.